So, do we dive in?
Yep, you're the man.
Ready?
Thank you for hosting today.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
nice to have a dialogue partner and to be on the interviewee end, and so I appreciate your guidance.
Well, I appreciate. I mean, one thing I like about this group is it gives us the opportunity to read these different texts, and when puts it on the front burner instead of the back burner. So,
Yeah.
thank you for that, and glad to talk about your chapter today. This is chapter 7 in the new book out, Thomas Torrance and Evangelical Theology. And this was edited by Mike Havitz and Lucas Stamps. Just came out a couple months ago. And Marty's contribution is Bart, Torrance, and Evangelicals, critiquing and reinvigorating the idea of a personal relationship with Jesus. And um, excellent. So you have a handout, which have found that it was in the on the Facebook page as well, which
Yep.
just is mostly just an outline, which but a few questions here and there to draw from. And of course, in the chat, folks can put comments or questions, and we'll draw those in as we go. Marty, you say in the introduction, the evangelical Christian life is proposed to be captured in a personal relationship with Jesus, but what does this mean? Is it possible? And what does it really look like? Uh, Maybe to start, um, what made you want to write this chapter? Focus on this idea.
Yes. Well, thanks, Jordy. The nature of my own upbringing is I grew up going to a large church, University Presbyterian Church in Seattle, which was an hour's drive away, and so the nature of any sense of a personal relationship was a far distant thing. I had one friend who I still know, David, who was there, but the idea of going to church for relationship was not exactly something that I got, even with humans. And it's a huge church. And so if you're sitting in the balcony, it's a football field away, kind of, to be able to even, hear or see other than through speakers. So to say, the nature of my experience of church growing up was largely impersonal. When I was a teenager, I went to Young Life, and the idea of a personal relationship with a God who loves and all that became, and particularly who has fun, became a more real possibility. But even with Young Life, which I still think is still the best, the whole question of what is it you are supposed to do to really have a personal relationship with Jesus? You go to camp, you make a commitment somewhere along the way, and then you're supposed to go home and read the Bible. You gather occasionally with others and read the Bible. But the question has burned for me for decades. What is it these people are talking about when they say a personal relationship with Jesus? And for that matter, what do they mean by a personal relationship with one another? Because yeah, there's a kind of a knowing, but is that really all there is? Is what we do in church really? Is that what personal relationships really are supposed to look like? And so I have been for decades really interested in trying to figure out what do we mean by personal relationship with humans, and beyond that, what does that mean with Jesus? And particularly because it seems to be a central motif in evangelical theology that Billy Graham and all of the churches that identify as evangelical, they want you to have a personal relationship with Jesus. But just yesterday, I was talking to somebody at Fuller Seminary, and she said, "Well, we all need personal relationships." And I said, what do you mean when you say personal relationship?" And she kind of stopped. And
Yeah.
it's usually again, it's the kind of, well, and it's like, no, tell me, what does it look like? And this is somebody who is, a paid staff person at Fuller Seminary. And so this is what I bump up against. People have a phrase for which they have no sense of what it actually looks like. And most of them have some sense, I think something's missing here. That's what drove me to write this chapter.
Yeah, it's much more of a, when we say personal relationship with Jesus, what classically, or I shouldn't say classically, what commonly is meant is an individual relationship with the individual entity we call God, revealed in Jesus. And so
which
it's,
has all
yeah,
kinds of problems, right?
two separate individuals in relationship, uh, and that's salvation,
Yeah.
if you get it right.
And then they get passed over to you for spiritual formation, also individual. And then it's like, well, who's the spirit who's doing this formation, and where's Jesus? Where'd he go for this formation thing? And oh, the Father. I don't know if I really want him to show up or not. I don't really know that much about the Father, much less having a personal relationship with the Father. So it's all very complicated, very quick.
Yeah. Now,
Like,
before we get into the details, this is a book about Torrance, TF Torrance and evangelical theology, but your chapter is Bart Torrance and evangelicals. So can you just say, briefly, why is Bart part of this conversation? What's the
yeah.
relation of Bart and
So to say
what's
that
the
Bart informed profoundly T.F. Torrance's understanding of the nature of the triune God. And to say even the opening statement in the church dogmatics is the church's scientific self-examination of its distinctive talk about God, is to say that what I call the science of the personal in Torrance, to say Torrance believes that the nature of studying God and our place with God is a scientific endeavor. And yet, for most people, that's a strange thought. And it's in some ways, I'd say he gets that from Bart. Bart is the one who invigorates the idea of God speaks. We respond to the God who speaks. We are drawn into a life that is gifted to us in the person of Jesus. So the nature of Bart's work is that, in a sense, he's the foundation, or the he passed the baton to T.F. Torrance. And because we're writing about T.F. Torrance, to say that Torrance thinks thoughts that are separate for Bart in the realm of personal relationships, I think he does develop on those things, but he's foundationally grounded in the work of Karl Barth. Tim says it seems this chapter is not dissimilar
yeah.
to Face to Face Volume 3. Um, there are ideas in that volume that is like saying the church dogmatics is similar to the Bible. Well, yes, the church dogmatics is similar to the Bible, but much more extensive.
Yeah. So yeah, I think so. There's kind of a genealogy here that Torrance is drawing from. Obviously, he's not totally or solely dependent on Bart, but so much of his framework is comes from Bart, and so it's a natural connection.
Yeah,
Um, and you're highlighting essentially these two words, personal and relationship, because we use it all the time, right? It's our
yep,
Christianity, is a personal relationship with Jesus. It's the same thing with spiritual formation. We use that language and we never ask the question, like in your case, you're asking the question, okay, what is personal? What is the person in
yep,
relationship? So if we haven't defined or clarified what a person is, then a person in relationship doesn't, we don't even know what we're talking about.
that's
Same
right.
thing with formation. If we don't know what the thing being formed is, then how can we even really talk about this very far? So you're just
Absolutely.
doing the good important work of getting us clearer on our terms, which actually is really reinvigorating for all of this. So
Yeah.
uh,
Can I say something, Marty?
Yes.
I really liked what you emphasize in your article, that it's not just an um, you know, inward thing inside of us, that really we are all doing theology in community. And I like that thought, because we cannot do, just have these thoughts by ourselves all alone.
Right.
This is something that needs to be expressed, needs to be communicated, to others who are led by.
Did we just? I think he just
We lose him?
lost.
He vanished.
Yeah.
Good
The nature of the
takeaway.
inward. I was in Australia speaking on relational theology there. In fact, on volume 3, which Tim just pointed out. And one of the professors of theology there said, yeah, this relational stuff, I kind of get it, but I really like the inward journey. And I just think of the spiritual formation kind of direction that people often think the spiritual formation is the inward journey. But to say that the nature of what personal relationship looks like in the person of Jesus, I think has a profound interrelatedness that needs to be included. And when it comes to the Father, I think people are often just at a profound loss of really understanding. Am I supposed to have a personal relationship with the Father? Yeah, Jesus I get, but I know we're supposed to come to the Father through the Son, but what does that really mean? And the Spirit becomes even more confusing.
Right.
And the Spirit, the idea of the Spirit being one who gives us ears to hear, but what does it mean to relate to one who gives us ears to hear? So anyway, I think there are complications because of our understanding of personhood in each of the persons of the Trinity that make that difficult. And then you show up at church and look at the back of somebody's head and the guy or gal up front speaking and go, this is a relationship? So yeah, something
If I
missing.
may, I'm very, very fond of using that beautiful word in Anglican theology from the 17th century, edification. Okay, it's edification. They loved it.
Yes.
And I'm very naughtily, continuously saying it's not very edifying to look at the back of somebody's head. It's a terrible pun, and I apologize, not at all. But it captures you so beautifully.
Yeah.
Oh, I wish I scribbled all over your essay because there were thoughts flying in all directions. Look out. I
Well,
may
they're
do
written
it
all
yet.
over the wall behind you. I can see the handwriting on the
Yeah.
wall.
Sorry, Geordie. Go for
No,
it, mate.
you're good. You're good.
All
So
good.
your essay has, it looks like 5 sections. I want us to touch on the first 2, but I don't want to
Yep.
get bogged down there because I think the meat, your constructive work is when you look at like the particulars about persons and relations.
Yeah.
But kind of if we can kind of do some bigger picture things or note some of the key things in the first 2 sections. So the importance of, first one is what's the importance of personal relating to an evangelical? I mean, in a lot of ways, that's pretty obvious. We talk about it all the time, right?
Well, it's obvious that it's important. It's not obvious that they know what it means.
Yeah.
Yes. It's, I
And
mean, the word
yeah.
mystery, I think for people, they just feel it must be a mystery. I'm doing what they tell me I'm supposed to. I hope I'm getting it. I'm not quite sure what to expect.
I'm trying to remember the name of the Supreme Court justice who was confronted with a case involving pornography, and the trouble there was, how do you define it? And he says he can't define it, but he knows it when he sees it. And that was, everybody laughed at that. But I mean, there's some relationships that I'm not sure you can reduce to words on a page.
That may be true, but there may be more there. I mean, again, this has been my life's work, so I have lots of ideas about what it looks like to fill in those pieces. And I sit with people doing therapy every week, and so I delve into the stories of people who are missing relationships to help them find the missing pieces. And often they know that something's not what it should be, but it seems pretty good, doesn't it? And then about 10 questions in, it's like, oh, we're missing some pretty basic things in what it would look like to have a relationship, either as a married couple or with teens, the nature of what develops, we take care of them, we love them, all that. It's like, yeah, well, let's ask the question, do you love your child? Yes. Do they know that you love them? Well, they should. Well, okay, that doesn't mean that they necessarily do. If we ask them, what do you think they would say? Well, I don't know. Well, there's something missing there then in what would be part of a relationship where there is a mutual knowing of something that would be there. The phrase, I told you I loved you the day I married you. If I ever change my mind, I'll let you know.
That's
Oh,
not
Lordy.
okay. So Marty, okay, section 1 says we believe in this, it's super important as evangelicals. Section 2, finding a better way, you kind of call out, I don't know if it's 4 or 5 different kind of, what would you say, ways that we get stuck, or
Ways we interpret it and miss the point.
distortions of this, or ways. So do you want to riff through those a bit?
Yeah.
Because I think that lays a foundation for that we do need a better way.
Yeah. Just the first statement that faith is a relationship. It's not something that happens in our head. That's the move of it's not just an inward thing. Faith is something that's developed with a person in whom you have faith. So somebody who has faith in science, they know science, they have faith in it. Somebody who has faith in their car, they have a relationship with their car, that they know it's going to work, or they don't have faith. And they'll tell you, I don't think we should take my car because I'm not sure it's going to make it. So faith is the relationship with that which is other than ourselves. And when it comes to persons, the nature of what is known, and using Torrance's phrase, katafusin, to know the nature of the other person in such a way that we live and act and respond to them with that knowledge, and we don't assume that what they necessarily thought a year ago is what they think today, or maybe even last week. Means that we know that they're there. We know that the investigative work, the indwelling through a conversation is important. So faith, the better way is going to say, is a current knowing and being known, not merely a set of beliefs about the other persons. And again, often when we introduce ourselves, we tell people what we do, where we live, and all that kind of stuff. And those are really the belief kind of stuff. And so Jesus is in heaven. He died on the cross. He forgave my sins. Hallelujah. And yet it doesn't take people into a sense of relationship, I think. So the issue of being self-centered, again, is the problem in all of these things. As you said, the individualistic sense is the problem of evangelical theology, is that it's focused on the individual doing something. So the idea of thinking and believing, that's largely interior, but it's also primarily dualistic. It divides the world into my thoughts and then my active being in the world, and it chooses the thought part. And so somebody may go to church and get all their thoughts, quote unquote, straight, but then they go to work and there's nothing about those beliefs that have been expressed or worked out in their life. So it's a divided, separated. People love apologetics, defending the faith, but again, that's a logic depending upon human reason, and it tends to miss the relationship. Christianity as an emotional journal, this is that internal sense of the emotion of I need to have peace, I need to have security, I need to know that I'm loved. And so they pursue Christianity as a therapeutic move to feel that they can make it through another day. And in some ways, the devotionals that are written largely attempt to address this, to give people a thought for today that help them feel loved and satisfied at some level. But it tends to, again, be quite individualistic. Christianity is a managed life. This is the life of, everything that person does has the word Christian before it. They go to a Christian restaurant and they have a Christian dentist, and they have a Christian hairdresser, and they make sure everything is Christian. Their car is maintained by a Christian. They're going to manage everything to make sure that everything is lining up with Christians, though there aren't necessarily relationships and all that. So everything has a Christian label on it, but you ask, why are you managing all this so much? And it's to appear a particular kind of way that you identify with other Christians in the world of your actions. And it may be somebody who volunteers a lot of the activism piece. And then the idea of Christianity as a restored relationship with God and others. This is what I'm calling the relational. That's what I'm heading for here. And the interpersonal, not just the personal, because the word personal can mean private. That's too personal. Stay out of that topic. That's too personal for me. So personal can mean private. So interpersonal is a fuller sense of the knowing and being known. Now we know in part, then we will know as we've been fully known. That's the interpersonal dynamic of the fullness that Paul sees in 1 Corinthians 13. And both for Bart and Torrance, this idea that God speaks. So the idea of voice, which again, as Tim has pointed out in my book, my third volume, the whole idea of heart and voice, that from the heart of a person they speak, and the nature of their voice isn't just the audible voice. It is the whole dynamic of how they show up as a person revealing themselves, but also engaging the one they're speaking to. So voice is a very interpersonal dynamic. And for many people, hearing the voice of God is just not something they quite know what even to do with. So that's a quick run through there.
Great. Yeah, thank you. When you're talking about emotionalism, it made me think of Christian bookstores always have the, how do they label their sections? And there's always the inspirational section.
Yes.
Which is such an
Yes.
interesting category, and that's probably one of the biggest categories, right?
Probably so. In a Christian bookstore, yeah.
And I love being inspired, but that when that becomes the kind of essence of our spirituality or our discipleship, that's not very deep, not very solid.
Yeah. Well, there is, if you just take the word inspired, there's a sense of breathing, to breathe something in, and the work of the Spirit. We construct it for fitting, your spiritual formation, to say the nature of inspiration is not merely a moment of great thoughts. It is a life of being aware of the Spirit speaking and drawing us into something,
Right.
which we would call the path of spiritual formation, possibly.
Well, and that's a good point. So much of what you're doing and what's important is to recover these words, right? These words
Right.
have lost their core meaning. They become something else in popular usage. And
Yeah.
so they send us down the wrong road, but actually they speak of a good thing.
Yeah. Enthusiasm, to be in God, en theos, right? But
Right.
it's enthusiasm is kind of like what you just said of inspiration. It can be a momentary, you can be enthusiast about cars or TV series or whatever, but to really say, what does the word mean, and what would it look like to reinvigorate a life that is enthused by God? Teilhard de Chardin, I think, talked about a conspiracy of love. To conspire is to breathe together a common love. And so again, the word spire as an inspiration is there too. But conspire, we tend to think of negatively. But what if we thought of it as a conspiracy of love? The church is the place where we breathe together. Brian will tell you in New Zealand they have this thing called the hongi. And a hongi, you rub noses, right? And it's the idea is
you breathe each other's air.
You breathe each other's air. And so when I started at Knox Theological Hall, that was the way I joined the Morai there at Knox Theological Hall. Was they all lined up, and you breathe the air of each one to become part of the community. And it's something like that conspiracy of love. Now it didn't have the full impact one would like, but it is paying attention. There's something about the physicality and the breathing of air pre-COVID that was attending to something about what it means to be connected to one another, to be a community that breathes each other's air. So anyway,
and I is it on this theme, Brian? You want to say something about Mark Holloway's book?
Oh, sorry. When you were talking about voice and heart and stuff, I thought, oh goodness, I'll spill the beans. There's this crazy, beautiful man who actually, ironically, is about a 55-year-old working for my son-in-law as a salesman in his property company. I mean, if you want how to sell something, talk to Mark Holloway. And he does it so graciously, and it's not manipulative. It's extraordinary. Anyway, Mark has a book called Freedom Diaries and a couple of follow-ups. And Kruger knows him well. Kruger Baxter knows him well. And I mean, part of me is a little concerned at times. It sounds a bit like sort of spiritualist dictation, if I can sort of, you know what I mean? I don't know if you've come across this art form that spiritualists enjoy. It's a bit weird and spooky. But on the other hand, time and time again, he nails it with having an absolute living conversation on a daily basis with Deus Dixit. And he says, look, how many times in the Bible does it say, hey, God says something to somebody and they go ahead and do it, or they don't do it, like Jonah? And I mean, it's crass. He says, we don't have those, do we? Should we? Might we? Dare we? And it's. I mean, thankfully, I've had a few of these. I mean, they're in monosyllables because I'm slow. You know, I mean, you worked that out a while ago. Some of you. It takes time to get through monosyllables. He speaks. He speaks, and that's all I'm doing here. So I'll post it for you, Geordie. And I mean, I'm still. I mean, I've known him for a while, but I'm still going. This is a bit spooky.
I've actually
Does that mean I'm too intellectual, Marty? I need some therapy, brother.
You do. Hallelujah.
Right, and I've actually last year I stayed several days in Mark's house.
Oh,
So I got to know.
You were here?
I was, yes.
You didn't. You ratbag.
No, that wasn't last year. Actually, that was gosh, time flies. That was at the beginning of COVID. I got into.
Oh, I didn't know you then. You're forgiven.
Right.
all day.
Yeah. Yeah, but because of, I think.
Sorry, I'll behave now.
I think that I was planning to visit Mark because I'd met him at a school of theology, and but then I got stuck at his house because of COVID for about 5 days. So we talked a lot about his books, and I think there's something really good there that he's. So yeah, thanks for putting that out there.
Oh, thank you. I mean, if you know Mark Holloway, you've just gone up in my estimation, Geordie. Bless you, brother. I'll behave now. I'll leave you to your job.
Before we go into I think the meat of the chapter where you start talking about shedding the old and embracing the new, anyone want to chime in on the better ways? I think in a way you pick them up in the next sections too, but.
Yeah, I had to raise my hand. It takes me a while to work the mouse.
You can say something.
Yeah, Dwayne.
Okay, I'll lower my hand. Yeah, I just think back of the stuff Dr. Houston, you know, that he always emphasized, like the part of the process that we're addressed by God, but he's addressing us all as particular individuals. And he always used to talk about how, well, I can't talk about him in the past tense. Just I'm talking about my past experience, but the particularization of the person when the Father addresses you, and you know, and because we lose that in our upbringing, if depending whether fatherless or whatever like that, because the thing that we also read in the stories of the Scripture where God speaks, but he also helps make yourself known to yourself. He knows who you are, and he helps you understand yourself. And then this leads to this whole understanding of uniqueness. That's the most difficult challenge for most people, and that the uniqueness in the way which we've been created, God has to address us to help us understand ourselves, because we can get our identities externally from our relationships with our parents or a teacher or, you know, or sporting experience or whatever. And then we have our own fascinations of us being the coolest, smartest, best looking, or whatever delusions we have. But there's a point there in reality where we find ourselves our life is hidden with Christ and in Christ. And then there's sort of an undoing of yourself where God's strength is made manifest in weakness, and then you sort of become what you weren't. Like Dr. Houston just talked about how you'd be transformed to something that you weren't, where you weren't loud and brash, you were timid and shy, but now you're confident. Like there's something that happens that you become what you weren't, and in the process of becoming who you are. And that's where the most difficult thing comes, because you have to have faith that this reconstructive surgery is actually helping you truly become yourself, and God's particularizing yourself. And that unknown process, however long we can stay in there, that really bears good fruit, but it's a hard, dark night, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good to call up Dr. Jim Houston's name in this. I think for at least Dwayne, Marty, and I, we were all at Regent together. And I remember when I was looking at seminaries, I mean, I looked at Fuller and Gordon Conwell and Princeton and a couple others, and stumbled upon Regent late, went up to visit, had a conversation with Dr. Houston where I asked him what makes Regent different. And he said, well, basically he said something like, the purpose of Regent is for students like you to become persons. And I was just like waiting for like the sentence to finish, or like just totally had no idea what he was talking about, but I knew that there was something important there. So Marty, say a little bit about the evangelical understanding of persons, and then we'll move into like the new possibilities.
Yeah. So the evangelical understanding basically reflects the culture we live in, which is basically a rugged individualist culture. Western culture identifies people who at some level have rights in their life to be who they are, to have their own space, to have their own resources, and we grant them this individuality, which is not the same as particularity. So, I mean, I use the word particular persons for what some people would say individual, because individual is entirely cut off in a sense from the other. Nobody has a right to invade my personal space, my bubble. And so we have all kinds of language for that kind of individualism. So the idea of getting somebody to go to somewhere where they're going to hear a preacher talk, they'll hear a message, they'll hear that they have sins, that God has done something, they can make a choice. And if they make a choice, then they will have entrance into heaven. It's what we call a human-centered gospel. And the person is this individual whose choices in some way define who they are. And so there's kind of a theoretical backdrop for that person, that God is there and does all that, but they really have to focus on themselves as a choosing being who's making a choice that cashes in on something, but it's going to be also about them to keep it going. They don't want to fail this lifetime kind of test, and there is often a sense of fear. I begin with Christ, but am I doing it right? Have I in any way violated my relationship with God through my lifestyle or things I say, or the fact that I just don't know so much? Some people just drift away. The language of Hebrews is all kinds of language of drifting and falling and all that. And so all of that are just functions of thinking of ourselves separate. And so the nature of the quote unquote connectedness is really just the human connecting to God, kind of, plugging into God to get energy, but God is almost not person in that sense, where I'm just tapping into the power of God or the knowledge of God, and then I'm going to live my life. I'll live my life for Jesus even, but it's really, I'm hoping that Jesus will make my life better. So human-centered. I have students constantly writing saying, Jesus is my example or my model. And I'm going, so Jesus is your example or your model. So he's over there and you're watching what he's doing, and then you're going to go do something that echoes what you've seen from a distance. Is that kind of what you got going? And that is generally it. So the basic sense there is that Jesus is somebody who is an individual over there, and I'm going to watch and see how he does things, and then I'll replicate that separate from him, but having watched him. It's like, well, that's not really a relationship in the sense that I would call a relationship. You'd actually like to have to know that person to be able to have something that has this connectedness. So again, virtually to a person at the graduate level, even students in the evangelical seminaries that I've taught in have this sense of, I need to imitate what Jesus did as something that isn't connected to being with Jesus in relationship. It's looking and knowing about him. I had one student who said, "You're the first theologian I've ever had who brought theology down to life where we live and relate." So theology tends to be a set of beliefs that I hold, and I say the Apostles' Creed. I may or may not believe it, but at least I can say it as an individual. I've said what I'm supposed to say. And so again, it's just affirming this individual. And in the end, we come because we have needs. We have needs, and Jesus is going to meet those needs. And so evangelical understandings of the person generally are this internal world that I want to nurture and develop so that I can be happy and joyful and free because I have done what I need to do.
Yeah, that's good. You reference Millard Erickson a couple times, and I wanted to read one of your quotes because I think it speaks to some Dallas Willard misunderstanding that comes out among people. But Erickson says, it seems reasonable to say that holding the beliefs that Jesus held and taught is part of what it means to be a Christian or follower of Christ. That is the particular concern of Christian theology. And then you say, we try to believe what Jesus believed instead of knowing him and through him knowing the Father in a personal relationship in the present.
Yeah.
And Willard has this line, it's significant, but I think it's often superficially understood. He talks about the gospel about Jesus and the gospel of Jesus. And when he says the gospel, so the gospel about is obvious, it's what we would want to say about him.
Yep.
But the gospel of is the gospel that Jesus was in himself. And people can hear that, I think, sometimes as like, oh, like Jesus lived a really good Christian life. He shows me the way. He's my example, and I should live like he lives. I need to recreate that table in my own house
Yep.
that he has, rather than being invited into his family table to know the Father with him and
Yep.
see what he sees in that relationship with him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's important point.
Yeah.
There's some
Bacon's got his hand up there too. So
let me read the chat comments too. There's
okay.
Brian says thisness, Colin Gunton's The One, the Three, and the Many spells out relatedness, particularity, and perichoresis as transcendentals.
Which I love that book.
And then okay, and Todd, that means, is that abstract? Bryden says that's abstract speak for how these three components drive everything and everyone. And Dwayne points out 1 Corinthians 12:27, you are the body of Christ and members in particular.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed it. Macon, is it Macon or?
It's Macon.
Macon.
Macon?
That's right, Macon bacon.
Right.
Making with bacon.
That's right. Marty, let me first thank you for treating evangelicals with such love.
I consider myself one still, yeah.
Yes, well, me too. And whenever I read something like this, I always start like, oh well, I'm gonna have to take some licks here before we get on to something meaningful. And I thought, oh wow, this is great. Like thank you for treating me well in this.
I hope to just feel like a doctor who has good bedside manners and says, I know where you want to be, and I'm going to do everything I can do to help you get what it is that your heart desires. So that's
right.
My sex
That's right.
For evangelicals.
So speaking of your critique of persons with evangelicals, if it's separable, how much do you feel like this is an evangelical problem, and how much is it this is a modernity problem regarding persons?
It's probably a human problem at this point. I mean, the question of whether mainline denominations, Lutheran, Reformed, whether they understand what a personal relationship looks like. Those I know who love the mainline or the ancient traditions, Eastern Orthodox, there is a sense of being part of a community with deep roots, the beauty of the liturgy and those things. I think beauty may be part of relationship, but once again, it can just be another medium that keeps you from the actual engagement with the person. So my sense is that your question is right on, that it's bigger than modernity. And again, this is coming from years of just asking what has philosophy since Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and others who largely had an inward turn. Incurvatus in se is sin, but it's also the inward turn of confessions for Augustine, and the nature of the Summa Theologica, that we want to have arguments for God. The nature of argument means that we have largely a rational relationship, which means that the rational has replaced the relationship. So to say, the Western tradition at some level has had problems of really just getting the basic of what it means to be a person. Boethius's definition of a person, the rational, let's see if I get that right. Who's got Boethius is the rational substance of an individual something.
Nature.
Anyway, nature of an individual nature. That's it. So rational individual nature. I mean, that defined really. I mean, I think Boethius is what, the 3rd or the 4th century. So if that's where you begin, then the whole Western tradition is going to have something that is going to be individualistic, rationalistic, separate, and gaining information to master their own lives and the world. The Eastern traditions have their own forms of challenge with that. There are people like Martin Buber with I and Thou, who's pressing beyond. He's one of the people that I look to, though I think John McMurray's even better. Martin Buber thought John McMurray was better than he was. So to say there is a huge minority in the world of theologians and philosophers that really understand personal relationships. And this is my big complaint. Science only has studied the world of objects and even humans as objects, which is great for medicine and for making clothes and other things. But we haven't done the scientific work on the personal. And that's one of the things with Bart and Torrance, is they've done the work, even with early theologians, and a biblical understanding that gives us a foundation for even talking about the personal in a way that goes beyond knowledge about, to use the term that Jordy just used, to really have the sense of indwelling the other and being indwelt. Recursion is a whole other thing. I didn't use the language of recursion here, but it's a whole other big piece. My TED Talk, I engage that subject on what deep personal relationships look like. So for most people, the word acquaintance is all that they need for a relationship. And so to say the Western person who feels acquainted to people thinks they have a relationship and they're satisfied with that. To even be acquainted with Jesus, that's good enough. If I'm acquainted with my kids, if I spend some time with them, go to work, and until they write a song about, a child arrived just the other day, came to the world the usual way, that's Cats in the Cradle, just that song in a sense epitomizes the loss of connection even within families. And I think it is all part of our Western tradition. So it's not just evangelicals. The thing with the evangelical is that they overtly say that's what they want. It's their confession that that is the hope and the dream. And I think it's the core of the gospel, that the nature of what it is that to be metanoid is to be transformed, because we come to know that we are known, that Jesus actually knows us, and that we're able to hear and know that we are known and know in response, and that becomes transformative for ourselves, and it transforms all of our other relationships as well. That's the distinctive of evangelical Christianity, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, Marty, why don't you take us into the sort of the positive um, in terms of what is Bart and Torrance offering us here?
Yeah.
What's the vision? What's the direction?
Yeah. And again, Bryden put up earlier the Deus Dixit to say all of the church dogmatics could be, unpacked or be seen to unpacking God speaks. And so to say the nature of a God who speaks, when speaking happens, then there is the possibility to know this other who wants to be known. So to say that, in classes, sometimes I'll just begin to try and break through into what we mean by persons. And I'll say, so here's a class of people. Can I get a volunteer? And somebody volunteers, and I say, so I'm going to describe this person, and I'm using the word person here to fool them, right? It's all a setup. I'm going to describe this person, and I just give all kinds of descriptions of their male or female. This is their age range. They probably do this. They probably make this much money. I just throw all kinds of information that might be true about them. And then I say, so do you know this person? Which people generally say, not really. At least not by what you just did. And so I think that's a lot of what happens in sermons is we give lots of information about. And so I say, well, what do we need to do to really know this person as the person they are? Well, we need to hear them. We need to have them tell us who they are. We need to hear what they feel. And then we can interact with them and say, say more about that. Tell us your story on that. And I say, that's the Bible. That is the revealing of Jesus in the Bible, who comes to speak to us, to address us, to engage us, so that we hear the voice. That we hear the voice of Jesus is the one. And so that's what Bart and Torrance do, is they make the person of Jesus available as the voice who speaks. In the beginning was the voice, and the voice with God. That's the opening of my second volume of Coburn Church Dogmatics for Everyone. Chapter 1, in the beginning was the voice. So the sense of voice opens up the personal. I have done some work. I'm hoping someday to do all of Paul's letters in first person of the three persons of the Trinity. So instead of blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, it's I am the God and Father of my Son, Jesus Christ, who's blessed you in the heavenly places through him. And Jesus says, blessed be my Father who's blessed you through me. And the Spirit says, blessed be the God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ who's blessed you through. The Spirit basically does what we have in the written text, because that's what the Spirit does. So the whole nature then of allowing Scripture to become the voice, now there's person, there's intention, there's inflection, there's direct address, that I am one who is a listener to one who's speaking to me and telling me who they are to me and all that. Now we're opening up the floodgates for the possibility of the relationship developing. And so Bart and Torrance both really emphasize the need to not categorize, label, all of those things of the nature of God, but that we are in a constant position as scientists of listening and exploring and delving more. What did that mean? And how are you addressing me? And what is it you're saying you are to me? Where are we going together in this? So that is the foundation of the Bart Torrance, is the aliveness of the person of God, Father, Son, Spirit, who speaks. And I would argue each of the persons have a voice that are distinct and yet unified. They kind of sing in harmony. Father sing bass, Jesus sing tenor. Anyway, yeah, we won't start singing that right now. But anyway, so in understanding that, now we have a foundation for what it means to be persons who exist by virtue of being in a relationship. And again, it was an article that I read on Bart's understanding of persons that was my huge breakthrough. In 1989, David Meal wrote an article on persons in relation in the Scottish Journal of Theology. He uses the image of two mirrors that face one another. When they see each other, it creates this corridor effect, one mirror going, and the closer they are, the more kind of that's there. If you get back about 3 feet away, you only get one or two images that are there. Translated into theology, when I know that you know what I know, and I know that you know what I know, and I know that you know that I know that you know, the more times you can do that, the deeper the relationship. And so to be able to say to somebody, do you know what Jesus is saying to you right now? Which most people say, no. Well, he's saying he loves you. Do you know that he loves you and that he's saying that to you right now? And some people will say, well, why do you say that? Well, he said he's with you always. And he demonstrates the love of the Father that he gave his life for you while you were still a sinner. So I think he still thinks that. And if there's one thing that you can hold to be true, is that he is saying that to you right now. And so for you to reflect that, oh, that's what he's saying. Yeah, I do accept that. And I love him in return as one who loves me. Right. And we just keep adding in the dimension of knowing and being known. And that is the sense of the depth where a relationship becomes deeply personal and not just a knowledge about the other person. You can sit at a campfire and say, you remember when you said this, 5 years ago, and I was thinking that you meant this, but then I found that you meant that. And then when I figured that out, it meant, well, then you must, that's all unpacking the dimensions of a recursive conversation that shows these people have a history that has this interaction. Sometimes we get off. Sometimes we actually do hear the depth of those things, and those are the people we feel close with. There was a study done for 3 years with newlyweds and college roommates about how well they knew the other, which is to say how much of a personal relationship they had. After 3 years, the graph showed that they had a very high level of confidence that they knew the other person. When they talked to the other person, the things they knew, they found it went down over the years. In other words, they had a greater sense that they knew what the other person was thinking or feeling most of the time, but their accuracy had gone down because they'd stopped really talking and had started to assume. So to say, when people go to church and just hear a lot of stuff, they build in all kinds of assumptions and don't stay in the current conversation that makes what I would call an authentic relationship. So the nature of the work that Bart does in 3.2, the work that Torrance does, the Christian doctrine of God and onto-relations, the nature of knowing and being known, all of that really breaks through into this. Even Polanyi's indwelling the other. To indwell is to know the other, what they are speaking or thinking or feeling or saying to us, so that we begin in this mutual indwelling to have something that's like recursion. And so this possibility, now we have the Spirit who comes in and gives us ears to hear what it is that Scripture is saying, that this address of the Son, the heart of the Father that comes and gives us a sense as the Spirit moves and we cry out, Abba, Father, it also hits us, that means I'm child. Now we are seeing that we're being opened up by the Spirit to know that we are known, to know how we are known, to identify ourselves in a way that is a reflection of what it is that the Father is towards us, and the Spirit is giving us a confidence that that is true about the relationship. So again, the work of Bart and Torrance is just opening up all of this interrelatedness in a way that I've just seen very few people do. I won't get into John McMurray, but he takes this even further in his Gifford lectures, The Form of the Personal. So that was very helpful for Torrance as well. So onto-relations, maybe another word that we use in some ways for what I've been describing with recursion, this knowing and being known. But Torrance doesn't go as far even as I would like him to, but we end up, the more we have these deep relationships with people, the more we become richer, deeper pieces. The particularity, using that term, of who we are grows as we have more deep relationships. And so the metaphor that I think Dwayne put up of the body and the part of the body we are, the more we are connected to people who we feed and they feed us, the richer we become in the depth of our personal being because of the web of relationships into which we are interwoven. And the word intimate becomes something you go, yeah, I feel like we've had conversations where I trust this person and I feel like we could reveal anything about ourselves to one another, and there's a love that creates space for that. Now the relationship has become trusting and open and has this depth of vulnerability and not fear, which I won't go into the whole thing of fear other than to note if you put your id, the id, in the middle of intimate, it becomes intimidate. And I think most people go to church a little bit intimidated by God, a little bit interpreted by the people up front, a little bit intimidated by what other people sitting next to them might think. And so intimacy is lost. There's a book by Ann Wilson Schaaf on addictions called Escape from Intimacy: Sex, Relationship, and Romance Addictions. All of them are a loss of intimacy. And I think for many people going to church, if you don't have a sense of really meeting with God, walking out, going, Jesus spoke to me today. I heard that I was loved. I heard that he knows what I'm going through. If you don't get that, church can become an escape from intimacy. I go through the motions, but the relationship is missing. That's probably enough for.
Now there's a lot there. This was probably one of my favorite sections. And then yeah, I think also when you talk about relations too, you use the image of a web to as a onto relations. So we exist in a field of relationships. You say like a web, our lives are interconnected so that each part exists in dynamic tension with the whole. You say each point where the lines meet is our personal being. So I'm just trying to like visualize this. So if you visualize a web, you've got obviously lines between points. So if the point is our personal being and the lines between are what enables our personal being to be.
They are the nature of our emotional state with them, which emotions are our relationship. We kind of separate out from that, but emotions are our relationship. If you love somebody, that is your relationship with them. If you're afraid of them, that is your relationship with them.
Right. Yeah. So it makes me think about, what we know about neuroscience and how we're making connections all the time and we dig those trenches and those become new lines and points that essentially become part of our being, like actually biologically.
Our biology is part of the whole being that we are.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about that connection between when we are in relation with others, things are actually happening on a physical level that are also true in a soul level or whatever, however we would say that. So I'm just sort of playing around with this further with you because I think when we think about what it means to be a person in relation, there's part of our personhood which is established by God. They can't be taken away, right? And then there's other aspects of our personhood that we gain through life and that we add on to through our interactions in this world. Some of those things we gain are helpful and good, and others are toxic and unhelpful. And some of those,
Dramatic.
thinking about the web image, I mean, some of those lines need to be like broken.
Well, they need to be restored, is how I'd like to see it. But I mean, you're talking somewhat about the image in family systems of a genogram, which a genogram you plot out and place people in terms of their relationship to you, and then you draw lines. The ones that are good are going to be solid and green and blue and things like that. And the ones that are difficult are going to be broken lines that can be red and orange and yellow.
Yeah.
And so all of that maps out with the lines, the nature of the dynamic. And then you can also draw lines between the different people and say, mom and dad, no, the broken line there. What would it look like to heal that line? Because when their line is healed, guess who else gets healed in that?
Right.
Right. So to see the interrelatedness of that. And I say to people often, choose the 10 most important people and put them on your genogram, both those that are, choose some that are good and also maybe some that are difficult. And virtually every time I say, so did you include the Father or the Son or Jesus or the Spirit on here? And virtually every time people don't include the Father, the Son, and Spirit. And I said, are they persons? Well, yeah. Are they important to you? Yeah, I just don't think of them. And this is my statement, I don't think of them having that kind of a personal relationship with me. Right. And so for me, it's just the evidence of the missing piece. When we think of the people who shape us in the way you're talking about, we don't include the three persons of the Trinity who should be the most profoundly influential in shaping who I am. And so the lines going to them in the web of relations, they should be almost the determining factor in all of that.
Yeah. and that's where healing happens. I appreciate your point that, I mean, my first go-to is, yeah, we need to like break some of those lines, because, and that's a total default to the idea of separation, that
Yeah.
separation is even possible. I mean, the reality is that these interactions, these relations exist, and healing is the way forward, not cutoff.
Yeah,
At
if
least
we got that in prisons, we'd be working with people. The day they show up in prisons, we'd have people who are working at the nature of how they become those who abused others and help them to understand their abuse and what it would look like to repattern, using your language of repatterning the brain, to be able to come out and to relate at some level with some part of society, believing that that is the nature of the restorative work of the gospel. And if it's a penitentiary where we are penitent and transformed by that, why not transform people in prison instead of just locking them up and waiting till they come out and hoping that it made a difference, which will probably only makes a difference for the worse. You've got a hand up there, I think.
yeah, and there's also a few comments, so we'll
There
go.
are, so go ahead with those.
Yeah, Bryden, why don't you speak, and you can also maybe speak to any of your chat comments too.
Well, Marty, I mean, bless you, mate, because what you're doing is diving into the obvious, and it's delightful when we see it as the obvious.
Yeah.
But of course, our problem is we don't. And I mean, that actually is the nature of the problem.
It is.
And I've lived internationally for lots of reasons. At one stage, language is plural, where, like breathing. Now, language is extraordinary. And I'm watching all our grandchildren, and we have 6 now. And it is amazing as an adult at my stage to really think hard about language.
Yeah.
We are assuming a conversation in English every week.
Yeah.
We visualize and we body language with each other every week. Welcome back, Matt. Sorry, mate, I'm going to pick on you, brother. and I mean, when we hide our screen, it's because we're having coffee or breakfast or something. I don't know. And that's Matt's in Darber, and that's fine. But sorry, I love you because you're so good, and that's why I'm cheeky. Language is something we have to learn.
With
We
each
have
person.
to learn personhood. We
Kiwi
have to
language,
learn,
even.
and
If you
then
go to New
when
Zealand
we
and go out
learn,
for tea, if you go out for tea in New Zealand, like I did, I showed up ready for a cup of tea, and guess what they gave me? A full-blown dinner. It's like, what?
yeah,
A
exactly,
full-blown meal? What?
Yeah,
So yeah, we
I
have
mean,
to learn in every context what our words mean.
and the beauty of the learning is we have to listen. We have to
And
observe.
response.
And then we make up our own words.
Yep.
I mean, tomorrow it's my son's 40th birthday celebration, and we're going bananas. And I'm being asked to give a 5-minute speech. And one of the words he made up I love this, and it'll come out tomorrow. Sorry, Daddy, I misunderstood you. Oh, wow, what a good word.
Yeah.
Now, Shakespeare is said in his day to have made up over 1,500 words, which we now assume. So I can go on. An interrelation is, in fact, a performance of language.
Yes.
24/7, in whatever medium, because it has substance. We live in an iconic, a sign-driven age.
Yeah.
And if I may go back one step in terms of the comments, St. Augustine has been accused of driving us inward, and there's a huge truth to that. But actually, what he's discovering is Luke Marion's commentary on Confessions, in the self's place. In French, au lieu du soi means instead of the self, as well as for the self, or where the self isn't. And what it is that God's id ipsum, him very self, sustains me, sustains you, is more interior to me than I am to myself, closer to me than I am to myself, book 10 of Confessions. And here we are in this web of relationships, to use your language, sustaining intimately every nexus point of connection 24/7 in a way that's utterly mind-blowing.
And we're blind to it.
And like the obvious, we're blind to it.
Yeah.
And confessions for me is an exposure of the obvious by the one who is in fact closer than we dare believe. Hence my poems in my Trinity book, which may or may not be good poetry. I mean, I don't know.
And the Greek word for confession is?
I forget.
Homologumena, to say the same thing together.
So it is.
So it is.
So it is. So thanks, Geordie. Go for it, mate.
Yeah, good. Macon says it sounds, this is a great comment. It sounds like the preacher, when preaching, is less preacher and more counselor about our relationship with Jesus.
Well, it depends on what kind of counselor you have. I mean, I do counseling, and I begin, tell me a story about what's going on. And then I'll say, okay, let's just back up. When you said this, or when you gave that look, what were you afraid of there? Because I can hear the resistance there. And I'll just, as a counselor, I'm engaged in the dialogue of getting into their words, their visuals, their intentions, and unpacking it all so they can see it. And then they start to go, oh, we're just missing each other. And communication sounds like it's just the words, but it's really the whole depth of hearing intentions, hearing the expectations that each had. That's all part of the communication too that most of us don't have access to. So if we had preachers who would have somebody up front every week and take a Bible verse and start talking with a person, so what do you think of this? Are you living this maybe? Or what do you hear Jesus saying through what he's saying here in this gospel? And people would then say, well, I hear this or I don't hear that. Everybody would be invited into a conversation that would actually build the relationship both with that scripture and the people who are up front. And I think even that listening in, this is why I think talk shows are so, people love them so much, is because you're invited into the conversation. You're not just lectured at. So I think we need better ways in the church to create invitational conversations. And I think that's what Jordy's involved with the open table. I think the open table in its very format creates this invitational conversation where even though you're maybe online, you feel walking away like, I know these people. They may not know me, but there's something that goes way beyond just having got a bunch of information about what they're talking about. These are personalized conversations that lead to a deeper sense there. Isn't that what you sense, Jordy?
Yeah, I think people just being honest too about where it's hard.
Yep,
And
the honesty is
walking
huge.
with each other and getting to, it's interesting just bearing witness to that. Watch.
Jordy just froze for me. Did he freeze for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Come back to us,
Marty. Marty, I've got a question for you.
So but we have two people who haven't had their hand up yet. Go ahead and put your hand up. I'm trying to get people in order. I think Macon had his up, and then Matt Young, and then Dwayne, and then we'll go to you, the other Matt. So the other to Mark. So Macon, go ahead.
So this is on your image of the web as it's trying to understand the onto relationships.
Yep.
When I began reading Torrance and heard him talk about, or read him talking about onto relationships and as the field in which we are interacting and existing, like that's that personalizing it. And it was several books before I understood him to mean, not like the field of medicine and not like a field out here, but like a gravitational field in the way that
a magnetic field too. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was an eye-opening moment for me. And then a realization of that is a hard concept to grasp, but it unlocks so much and so I when you went to the web, when you described web, instead of like a gravitational field or a magnetic field, I thought, oh, that's a little more graspable. It doesn't quite get it all, but so my question is like, did you make that choice because you're like, this is a little easier to get than trying to help people understand? This is what Einstein did in terms of us understanding everything. Like, why did you go with that instead of a field theory?
Yeah. Well, the nature of field theory with Clerk Maxwell, on the nature of electromagnetism was part of what I got there. But going back to when I was doing my doctorate in New Zealand back in the early 90s, before there were cell phones, I used the metaphor in my doctorate of phones and the nature. If a phone is working, it's connected. If you have a phone but it's not connected to the web of what it is that is represented by the network of the phone system all working, then the phone is bodily there, but it's disconnected from the web of what would be the relationships that are represented by that. So it was the metaphor that I used initially back then of relationality, except it was the phone web, which later the World Wide Web came along, and we had more developments into those relational ways of being. So there you go. So Matthew, I'm going to go to you.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be back. I was away because I was finishing reading your article. I wanted to make sure I read it first before I jump back in. But thank you. It's good to be missed and back to the beloved community here. So we're doing Alpha at my church, and one of the things we were talking about in our Alpha group was the idea of seeing it as relationship building and not just transferring knowledge, but the way Alpha is structured, it's very much you have a meal, then you get some content, then you have a discussion. And one of the things that one of our new members in our church brought up the idea, of not making it feel like a trap, where you invite people in and then you're like zapping them. So I said a way around that, a way to think about that is just that we would genuinely be curious about what people think about this stuff. Like put the content out there, and I might nuance the content a little differently here and there, but there's good stuff there. But I want to know what they think. We genuinely want to know. So seeing it around your emphasis on relationships as cultivating a relational field and valuing that and seeing that as a win. Like that's the win, and trusting the Holy Spirit to work in that, knowing and being known as we're seeking to know God. And I feel like that opens up a space for a different kind of understanding of even what evangelism is, being beloved and known. I really want to know what you think. I genuinely do, because it's fascinating and I want to take notes, So anyway, I think that got some resonance in the room, and it is what excites me about it. So
if we went knocking on doors and just saying, I want to get to know you, tell me your story, instead of have you heard the 4 spiritual laws? And I want to hear your story, and I want to tell you my story, and you just end up neighbors. It's like you've probably done more building relationship in that than you do with a lot of the traditional quote unquote evangelistic modes. Good. Thank you. Dwayne.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I just want to quickly read a section here from Hebrews 4, like commenting on how God knows and beyond our awareness. And I think that's the great mystery, and that's the exciting part. That therefore let us strive to, this is Hebrews 4:11, set in the context about the rest that we're into. Let us therefore strive to enter the rest. For the word of God is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword, piercing the division of soul and spirit, joints and of marrow, discerning the thoughts and intent of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but we're all naked and exposed to the eyes of whom we must give account. That a lot of times we don't realize how great comfort that is, that he knows. That he knows even more than we do. He knows the thoughts and intent of heart, not only the thoughts and intent of our heart, why we did what we did, what we thought we were doing something intentionally for our own well-being or negative, and that the section sets up the next context. The great high priest. This is the good news. If you understand that you can be unveiled, you can be exposed, like the Bible uses that phrase, nakedness. Like that's what we are. We're naked and exposed. It says, since we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession, this one who knows everything about us and everything in the world. For we don't have a high priest who's able to sympathize with our weaknesses. and yet he was in every respect has been tempted like we are without sin. Like, that's the greatest comfort, that there's no sin that we've ever done that hasn't already been done, that hasn't, like, and that's the good news about him knowing everything about all of humanity, all at the same time. The the omniscience, we don't use that word, where God knows us, but it's not a detached and personal. It's part of God's narrative and part of God's story, where he knows us, he knows our interconnectedness, and that gives us confidence to face ourselves, because we're not suffering something in darkness, that sin blinds us to our own hurt. Like, it's all about healing, and that the changing your language around about the healing process. Like, God's come to heal us, he's not come to judge the judges. In fact, he's healing us.
Absolutely. That is, I mean, I wish the word salvation, I wish we used the healing of relationships and all that are implied within those. I mean, that is what it is that is happening in all of the nature of what we call salvation that people don't use. So anyway, absolutely, all of that is appropriate. Mark, to you.
All right. Marty, would you say that the biblical word koinonia, in other words, which is translated fellowship in English and probably actually means a lot more, is actually a good word for relationship?
There's a song, koinonia means fellowship. Koinonia means love one another. It is a biblical word that I think implies what it is that we're pointing into here. People use it sometimes in a way that's consistent with it. Sometimes they put it on their fellowship hall, the koinonia fellowship hall, and they eat meals there, but they don't have the conversations that we're talking about. So, as Bryden was saying, we can use a word. The question is, are we using it in a way to open us up to a life with one another that is true to the word? In my first book, I say everybody, well, not everybody, but people know grandma's coleslaw, but everybody has a different grandma who has a different recipe for their coleslaw. So you really have to say, how did your grandmother make coleslaw? And then we find out they all have these little bits that are different and make one wonderful, and we can do potato salad or whatever. But koinonia is another one of those terms. We may grow up in a church that's named Koinonia Fellowship, but you had an authoritarian person who didn't really give people the space. So it may be the name on the door. It doesn't mean they've understood the nature of the work of the Spirit in opening up to the vulnerability and all that Matt was just talking about, the nature of what it means to be people who can sit with one another and have it, again, bringing in another discipline of attachment therapy, to have a safe sense of being in this place. Most people who don't have secure attachments are afraid either of the other person, or they're afraid people will find out who they are, or they're afraid that they're not good and these people aren't safe, and so they just shut up and tune out. To find people who actually can create a safe enough space where koinonia describes, when I'm in this fellowship, I feel a common life of knowing and being known. These people hide nothing from me, and I feel no need to hide anything from them. And it feels like love and acceptance, and it heals me from all the things that I've experienced elsewhere. Then I'd say, okay, you have experienced koinonia.
So, Marty, I'm back.
Welcome
My
back, Jordy.
computer, for some reason, dropped out of the internet, so I'm on my phone now. So just wanted to let you. Not
We're
quite
just
sure.
talking about the loss of the web with Jordy getting cut off and needing salvation for his connection, and now he's been restored and healed and redeemed and brought back into the web of relating. And anyway, back to you.
Wonderful. So are we ready to look at relationships part? We talked about persons.
Sure. We'll say
and,
goodbye to Macon, who's leaving us, but goodbye, Macon. He's got to go to work, I guess.
And so there's the evangelical problems with relationships, with our understanding about it, and kind of similar issues with persons, just how that obviously is going to affect relations. Anything more that before we get to the constructive?
Well, again, just to say the nature of Descartes and Immanuel Kant, both of them saw the nature of reality in thoughts, basically. I think, therefore I am. And so the evangelical sense of relationship is if I think about you or I think about Jesus, then I must have a relationship without having any sense of groundedness in the other. Immanuel Kant's transcendental unity of apperception, where I look at the world and I interpret it and I create the meaning, in a sense, what it is me creating reality, which means I haven't allowed reality to create my reflective ways of being. So this is 180 degrees from Torrance's Katafusen, where we come to a person and we get to know the person as they reveal themselves to us. That's the exact opposite of Kant. So to say our Western traditions generally, including in our Bible colleges and our seminaries, have a profound propensity to collapse into wanting to be rational to compete with the world. There was a period in time where seminary professors were told to go to Harvard and Yale and get degrees so they'd have the authority and to be able to rationally present Christianity. And so, again, this would even be a place like Fuller. The nature of the way they formed then relationships were through a rational mode that was supposed to build relationships, but actually created a cul-de-sac in the brain that did not allow the network to be connected. And so people would go to church, get the rational defenses for the faith, the rational sense of how you manage your thought world, but it wasn't connected to life and it wasn't connected to other people. And at some level, it felt like we're as good as those people at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all. We've trained with them, but we're one step better because we have Jesus. But it really, in a sense, undercut a generation understanding the relational nature of what both Torrance and Barth are going to call dogmatic theology, which dogma is, it's heuristic. It's the discovery of something that keeps on discovering. The word mystery, continuing to plunge into the mystery, even if it's your wife. And the day you say, well, I know her better than she knows herself, or I mean, we're all men areas. I know her better than she knows herself is probably a day that you've just become arrogant and cut off and missed the mystery of what's before you that ever invites us anew to discover today what is there in the field of connectedness and all that. So the problem of evangelicals is that we were trained in a generation that really defaulted. And I think this is the problem of when philosophers try and do theology. So Dallas Willard, this is the complaints I've heard, that he is a philosopher before he's a theologian. He provides a lot of things, but there are some default pieces that are still philosophical and working out of a rational approach to understanding all these things. Doesn't mean he doesn't have huge things to contribute, but just to say, those kind of people, I mean, even Josh McDowell, Evidence that Demands a Verdict, it was really a rationalizing that said, who you are as a Christian is somebody who needs to defend the faith. And you are a Christian, therefore, who you are is a defender of a set of beliefs. Well, what does that do for relationships? It puts up a lot of walls and barriers and weapons of war and things like that. So that I think is partly the problem of what has arisen in terms of the nature of evangelicals trying to compete with the world and not recognizing what you fear, i.e., we fear losing the intellectual battle. What you fear, you tend to create. And what they did is they lost the battle because everybody got stuck in their own heads and didn't live this. By this all will know you're my disciples if you love one another. That is the authenticating relational dimension that we're aiming for.
Can I just say one thing from Earl Palmer?
Go for it, Matthew.
That the great Earl Palmer, when I was at a pastor's conference with him probably 10, 12 years ago on the East Coast, he had been at that point like teaching pastor at National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and they were loving him. And we were kind of just listening to his experience there. And you know what Earl said he thought was the number one problem with the Congress was, at that point, Earl said, it's a lack of relationships. They were not befriending each other. that they would go home every night and get on the trains and go to their homes, and they weren't. And he thought about, I think he was making a proposal, they should all have to live together, in one big place. We should build a place for all the congressmen to live together. Anyway, that's just very profound, isn't it? Given where we are now, that was, God bless you, Earl. That was very profound, and it
But I'd
comports
say right now they are in relationship, bounded together by a common fear, right? It divided around the fear of what will happen if the other is there. And so, yeah, Bowen in Family Systems Therapy says the glue of families today is anxiety, a form of fear. It's what holds them together, the fear of not doing it right, the fear of what people will think, all that. And so the same would be true in Congress, that they're so afraid of what would be lost if they were really friends across the aisle. Yes, they have relationship. It's just a tragic relationship grounded in fear.
That's good. Yeah, so we're left with this framework of basically approaching life from performance and competition and fear, separation as the presupposition to all of our relationships, rather
It's
than
the same with liberal and conservative churches. Same problem as Congress, right?
Yeah. And so part of the challenge for us, I think, is just envisioning another way, right? Like, people don't have the imagination. It's not their fault. It's just because they don't see the models of it, or we don't point out the models that maybe are out there, the realities that are already out there. They can't envision a different way. So talk about this other way of understanding relationships. I mean, I guess we have in a way, but
well, I've got something that's not exactly on the page, but it speaks directly to this point. This is from John McMurray's work. When a child is born, they are loved by their mother and then ultimately father. There comes a point, though, where they begin to develop a sense of, do I fit in this family? Am I loved and cared for? John McMurray proposes that a child growing up much of the time develops this sense of fear that either I'm not seen or respected, and so I need to withdraw to my room and to my head, and they become withdrawn kind of people. The others say, if they don't love me, I'm gonna rebel. I'm gonna show them. This is the fight or flight response, right? And so McMurray suggested that nature of the fight or flight response that is grounded in fear is actually the ground of what became Greek society, withdrawing into the head, doing philosophy, mathematics. As a culture, it was the fear of not being sustained, and they withdrew from the world and thought about it and became wise, but they weren't known, with the exception of a few exceptions for their military. Rome became the fighting mode. It controlled the world through its management, through its organization of roads and military and nature of governments, law, all of that. And we got those two things in our Greco-Roman culture, all grounded in those two parts, borrowing from those, but it's grounded in fear. When Christianity hit Greek culture, we got Greek Orthodoxy, which largely through signs and symbols, we retreated to the eschaton, and it didn't have a profound sense of what it means to live here in the world. When Christianity hit Roman culture, it developed Roman Catholicism, a managed way of taking Christianity to rule the world for fear of losing what it would look like. The Hebrew culture, he suggests, was grounded in the nature of God, who loved them as a people, and that there was a sense of community, though even there, the Pharisees became Roman. They managed to control the world. The Essenes and the mystics ran to the hills in a Greek mode, withdrawing from the world out of fear. And so even within Judaism, you lost the dimension. John McMurray says the world has yet to see a form of Christianity that recovers the loving nature that was originally there in the Judeo form of it. When Protestants came along, the Protestants were protesting against Rome. So for the most part, they took on the control the world, manage, gather, manage, get doctrines. There are some, one might suggest that Pentecostals have a little bit of a Greek tendency there. But so to say, the very culture in which we live in, the Greco-Roman dimension, has shaped the church in ways that are grounded in fear. The other way is the way of love. The way of love says, I will be committed to a life for the other, with the other, without losing dignity and respect for myself. We will have a church, but we will not be over against anyone in this town. We will be present. We will be vulnerable. We will be known. We will allow ourselves to be known. We'll know them. So the course of love as the motivating factor is the central motif. And I think Barth really gets that. The God who loves in freedom in CD 2:1. Everybody talks about CD2 with the election of Jesus, instead of Calvin's sense of individuals being elected. But you really have to get the epicenter work of the God who loves in freedom to see that the whole of the dogmatics really comes out of a foundation for what does it look like when the church lives out of a loving God, and that love informs the nature and character of what it means to be evangelical Christians. And his evangelical theology book, I think, is a reflection of that. The degree to which people haven't understood Barth, they've turned him into a Greek. They've made him a thinker, right? And not read him with the deep biblical Jewish sense of what it means to be those who come and listen to the loving God who speaks and transforms us into a loving community. So my hope is that Barth, and Torrance, I think, gets that too. His Onto-Relational Language, The Mediation of Christ, as a book presents. I mean, there's lots of ways that we see Torrance opening the way again for the Trinitarian loving God. So for the church to really get to the core motive of how you understand God is going to shape everything. And right now, the left wants to be socially engaged, active, change the world. Great. And you're afraid that those conservatives aren't going to allow you to do it. The conservatives have all these values they want to defend and positions on particular kinds of issues. And so they're afraid of the liberals. But both of them are so grounded in fear that the churches then reflect that fear, and the nature of the triune love of God that undergirds Torrance and Barth makes Torrance and Barth a unique something off to the side instead of recovering the essential character of what Scripture is calling us into.
Hey, Marty, what's the reference? Was it for the Greek and Roman fear? Was that McMurray?
That's John McMurray, yeah.
Is that an essay or a book or?
There are mentions of it in about 3 books. The easiest way to find them is you can access my PhD online, and the references will be in there. But the clue to history is one of the good places. The clue to the history is the person of Jesus. And what I just unpacked there was a little bit of the nature of the history that McMurray shows comes from that. I think that Freedom in the Modern World also has sections on the Roman Hebrew Greek. In my third book, my third face-to-face book, there's also sections in there dealing with the Roman Greek Hebrew distinctions and the way that plays out in families. So anyway, there are a number of places you can access that.
Thank you. We're getting late on our time, so I don't know what else. Feel like we could continue on, but I don't know what else people want to hit on, if there's anything specific.
So there are some comments on the side. Do we believe in family? Tim asks. Barth didn't use the word family much because the word family itself is one of those words that's been so twisted that it often becomes a controlling thing rather than the nurturing sense which the family of God would imply. Paul says, I bow my knee before the Father from whom every family in heaven and earth derives its name. So to suggest the nature of what we might mean by family, if we begin by the life of the Father, Son, Spirit, and don't want to force the word family on them, but to say that the very nature of the communal life of God informs what it might look like for us to become families that reflect that, would be a way of discussing that. And I also have a section on that in my third face-to-face book as well. Brian, your comment on Barth and conflict, you're struggling with CD1. Well, you probably would struggle with CD3, 4 also. At some points, the nature of what Barth gives, he was not a perfect being, and he said, he was never a perfect being. I think that the nature of the perfections of God in CD 2:1 to say God is the one who is both holy but also merciful. He shows us, and he showed Bart the nature that he was a sinful being, and that even within his relationships, he is a sinful being. But the love of God, the yes of God, is even greater than our sinfulness. So to say Bart is truly a witness to the love of God, and to the degree that he could, he lived that. But we can't hold him up as another model. He's not a Jesus figure. He's simply Carl the Bart, the person who pointed to the one, and his picture of John the Baptist pointing to Jesus on the cross. That's Carl Bart. He's just simply saying, "Hey, don't look at me. Look where I'm pointing. There's the answer. If you think I'm the answer, then you're missing where I'm pointing." So I think that is my best understanding of that, if I'm understanding your question.
Yes, I said CD 2:1 because you picked up love and freedom. I think, Marty, what we're beginning to have to grapple with is Charlotte's moving into the home in 1929.
Yes.
So that there was literally a ménage à trois for years.
Yes.
And because she uses so much personal correspondence, letters and the like, we have to kind of go, I'm not going to actually be judgmental,
Yep.
nor am I going to suspend judgment. I think we are actually being asked by the providence of God, dare I suggest, to say, hey, folks, what does the gospel look like in this extraordinary triangle where there's no doubt that his poor wife, I'll use the word, was extraordinarily unhappy. I mean, sorry, unhappy.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's so difficult, I think. Here we are, almost 100 years later, kind of with our polyamorous rhubarb. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to call it that. We've had a very famous case right now in New Zealand where community of property and how to divide property between one man and two women who've lived together for 12 years. Oh dear, haba, you are in for a fight, folks. Look out.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be very, very careful about what holiness and sin looks like. As I read this book, I'm going, well, hang on a moment. What's this screwing with my brain with? How's this screwing with my heart?
Yeah.
And I think it's a very, very important book to come to grips with as we suspend judgment, but also engage in judgment. It's a very, very important book.
Yeah. Well, and in the end, God is the one who is the judge, and we are not. In conversation with George Hunsinger this week, he said, you have to realize the level to which both Charlotte and Nellie were committed to what it was that Carl Bart was doing. We can look at the relationship, but both of them really understood that what Carl Bart was doing was providing the church with something unlike what it had had for, potentially hundreds of years. And so he said, Charlotte was very aware of that. And Nellie endured at some level because of that. And Nellie continued to care for Charlotte even after Carl Bart died. And so Nellie recognized Charlotte as a person, not as an opponent. And she was able to wrestle through because she too recognized, and the children benefited from it. But we have to acknowledge they all lived in very difficult situations. They survived. They did not make this public. He never used what was going on to justify anything that anybody was doing. So it's only fairly recently that anything has come out. So to say he was not trumpeting anything of what it was that he was doing. And again, I'm just finishing working through 3-4, and his statements on marriage and relationships. You just go, Carl, were you listening to yourself here? And I asked George about that. And he said he was very attuned to the nature of what would be called a highly obedient relationship to the God who loves and serves. So he's writing what he knows to be the truth, even as he pleads with God for mercy for the sinner that he is, as we all should. So if we hold the tension together that we are all sinners and saints, and this is Jeff McSwain's work, right? And that Bart knew that. He didn't to no one did he use any of his theology to try and justify it. So he lived in, as you're reading, in a place that the people were close to him said was horrible for everyone in a sense. And yet out of it, we also have to say, out of the cross, the greatest tragedy in human history, came the greatest blessing to humanity. And out of an undesirable place here, God used even that to offer something to the world that one would have to say that the grace of God allowed for God's truth in the end to win the day.
Marty,
I'll
you
also
also
have
have
one
to look.
pointer before. Sorry, yes, Mark, go for it.
Oh, thanks, Bryden. I think also I've had to look at the end of the story, because in the end, Karl Barth reconciled with Nellie, and Charlotte actually had to be put in a home because she had Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And so we look at this and we see that in God's mercy, it actually did get resolved. He did reconcile with his wife.
And I've stood
And
at their grave, and all three of them are there, right next to one another. The family, and they were buried there. There is a kind of honoring that I'm not willing to say that I'm going to point the finger and say they didn't work through things, as you're saying, that are beyond what we decades later are trying to come in as judges.
And I'll toss in thank you, Mark. I mean, you're so right. It's an ongoing dynamic, and it's very curious. I will also point to a very important parallel in the 20th century again with Adrian von Speer and Hans Urs von Balthasar. I mean, I don't know if that's their books are in your library much, but I
have some
dabble.
von Balthasar.
Yeah, I mean, she and he were an extraordinary couple. And one is an ex-Jesuit, the other is, well, what is she? I mean, what is Adrian von Speer? I can't make her out. I mean, she's so mystical, it's frightening. And yet there's no doubt she has massive input into Herrlichkeit and Theodrama in a way that is quite staggering. Yeah. And who wrote what is a bit like Macrina and Gregory, to be frank, of the 4th century. The sister-brother duo, and I think we're presented with Barth on the
Peter
one hand.
Lombard, Heloise also.
Yeah, absolument. Oui, c'est vrai. And I mean, a dangerous scenario. Let's not go there today, please. Knives were out. Now, the thing that is staggering for me is going, well, hang on. How is this with von Speer and Balthasar, Nellie, Charlotte, Karl, and I'm deliberately using Christian names.
Yep.
How does this work for a culture that is now so confused?
Yeah.
And we are. Sorry, we are so confused.
Huge question, isn't it? Yeah. Dwayne's hand's been up for a while here. I feel like we need to get to Dwayne. His hand's gonna get tired.
Yeah, sorry, Dwayne. All yours, brother.
Oh no, that's all right. I just find it's like the Psalm says, and I marvel every day, and I'm sure you guys know this, like, as wannabe followers of Christ or wannabe theologians, and the way Gordon Fee put it, what is his definition of a Christian? Anybody who wants to be one, because you want to be one, but you're not. You don't have that ontological capacity to be this by nature. It's a gift, and you participate in. And he removes your sins so far from as east as from the west, and he does that all the time. But the consequences of in this in-time space, the already but not yet, there are sins that I actually still not that I'm going to brag or whatever, like I'm not like say I was a blasphemer and a murderer and God forgave me. So this is an example, but that's the testimony. Jesus died for all have died. let's move on beyond living in this way of death and darkness, but let's come to the light, come to the one who's forgiven us, the one who extends mercy. And we, new mercies I see, like the Psalms is all full of new mercies each day, new mercies. And our lives are testimonies of that. And whether it's Carl or others, because you find out the stories after the fact, you find out people's biographies, intrigues and stuff like that, and that's the thing, like, I know the intrigues in my life, and what I've seen and what I've done. And I know new mercies I see every day. And that's, so we don't point the finger. We try and learn and realize God is gracious, but the fingers are pointed back as us, because, that's why we're not the judge. And that's why I brought out that Hebrews 4, this high priest who knows the thoughts and intent of the heart, to divide between soul and spirit and bone and marrow. He knows that so well, like, because we don't even understand our own selves half the time. Why do we do what we do? If I could stop my self-destructive behavior, I might be able to move forward. I'm doing too well. I got to shoot myself in the foot. I get rewards for anything.
I think that's a good word from Dwayne, and maybe a good way to kind of close this conversation is, Marty, if you could read the first 2 paragraphs of your conclusion. I think you sort of summarize the heart of your thing very well in those first 2 paragraphs.
The first 2 or the last 2?
The first 2.
So a central tenet of evangelical practice is that one has a personal relationship with Jesus. This point raises some critical questions. What does it mean to engage in a personal relationship? Is God personal?
Marty, the conclusion?
Oh, the conclusion. Sorry.
First 2 paragraphs. Conclusion.
Of the conclusion. I see. Now I'm with you.
Yeah.
We were just out of relationship there for a minute. Evangelicalism's goal in desiring a personal relationship with Jesus is good. But by defaulting to an individualized understanding founded in Western thought, it has succumbed to a version of relating that sees the human as an agent separate from the other, who is God. A more robust understanding opens humans to think about the nature of persons out of the heart and relating of God toward us. Jesus does not have a wonderful plan for our life in any way separate from God. We are invited to share in the triune God's eternal relatedness. God persists with us to the end. Our relationships exist in the context of God's irreducible, interactive, mutually invested way of being together with us. If relationships are only ideas we believe in our heads, they become a philosophy. If they become a set of practices that operate externally as rules to guide us, they become a religion.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for pointing us to a better way of understanding persons and relations. And I hope that people will read this chapter and begin to integrate it into their lives. I loved what Matthew shared about Alpha, and just kind of the treating with the dignity that you actually want to get to know them, that it's not about just convincing them, that you care about them in this relation and as persons. And so we want to be those kind of people at home,
Amen.
At church, at the grocery store, when we drive, in all ways. So thank you, Marty.
Always. And thank you, Jordy, and everyone else for showing up. Have a blessed day. And remember, it's all about relationships.
All right. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.